But we're Americans, so we like to start on time. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honored guests. It's a beautiful day in Washington, and a good day to pause and reflect on the blessings of liberty and to honor those who were denied it by those who feared liberty. This is the 6th anniversary of the dedication of the Victims of Communism Memorial. And I am pleased to announce that we have achieved a new record in attendance. 18 foreign embassies are here with us this morning. From all over the world, from Eastern and Central Europe, from Central Asia, from the Baltics, from all over the world. Plus, there are more than 10 citizens groups representing those who still live, and not by their choice, under communism. I would now like to ask Father Arnie Panula, who is the director of the Catholic Information Service here in Washington, D.C., to give us an opening prayer. Father.
Heavenly Father, we bow our heads as we ask your grace upon us. We've come to gather here to celebrate the freedom with which we have been endowed in this country, a freedom which we do not take for granted by any means, and a freedom which could be extended to those of all of your children throughout the world. We pray especially that grace of yours upon those who do not live in freedom, those who at this moment are suffering under a communist oppression, who have had their freedom, their physical freedom, their spiritual freedom denied to them. We ask you, Heavenly Father, that through the work of this organization, the Victims of Communism Memorial, that attention be brought to those places in the world where the struggle for freedom continues. We ask you to help the directors of the Victims of Communism Memorial in their new effort to establish a museum to keep alive the memory of freedom and also the memory of those, the many millions of those who have died, who have given their lives, suffering precisely in the struggle for freedom. We ask this in your Son, our Lord. Amen.
Every year at this time, I'm privileged as chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to give a brief status report on the work of the foundation. So 6 years ago, we dedicated this memorial, the only memorial in the world to the more than 100 million victims of communism. Accepting the memorial on behalf of the American people, President George W. Bush said, "It's fitting that we gather to remember those who perished at communism's hands and to dedicate this memorial that will enshrine their suffering and sacrifice in the conscience of the world." Over the last 6 years, dozens of national leaders around the world have visited the memorial to lay a wreath and to pay their respects to the victims of communism in their country, to honor heroes like Milada Horakova of the Czech Republic, Ramon Rodriguez of Cuba, Father Jerzy Popolesco of Poland, Tran Van Ba of Vietnam, and Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty of Hungary. American ethnic communities have come here to say a prayer for those who died because they bravely resisted tyrants like Stalin, Mao, Castro, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, and Kim Il-sung. And if you had been here last week, you would have joined the candlelight vigil for the student victims of the Tiananmen Square massacre. This memorial has become what we hoped it would, a gathering place to remember and honor those who died under communism, and an international symbol of man's unquenchable thirst for freedom. Our online Global Museum on Communism, launched in 2009, continues to attract visitors, free and unfree, from around the world. It is the only museum on the internet that tells the story of communism from Marx to Mao and beyond. We have had nearly 173,000 unique visitors from 181 countries, including China, Vietnam, and yes, Cuba. We've now completed our latest educational project, a curriculum on communism for high school students. It's an interactive 9-lesson plan for teachers to help them instruct their pupils about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism. We will begin marketing the curriculum in print and electronic format to public, private, and home schools this fall. But that's not all. That's not all. From the beginning, our foundation has dreamed of a bricks and mortar museum on communism here in Washington, D.C. Many have applauded the idea, but no one stepped forward with the necessary seed money until now. I'm pleased to announce that the Republic of Hungary has made a $1 million donation.
Bravo!
A $1 million donation, enabling us to start planning an international museum on communism in Washington, D.C. And we are profoundly grateful to Prime Minister Viktor Orban and the government and the people of Hungary for their generosity and their faith in us. We will not let them down. And in the coming months, I'm pleased at that applause, in the coming months we will invite our other friends and supporters like you here this morning to join our international campaign to build that International Museum on Communism in this great capital city. You know, sometimes I'm asked, why do you bother? The Cold War's over. Communism's dead. But ask the political prisoners in China's Laogai whether communism is dead. Ask Cuba's ladies in white whether communism is dead. Ask the Christians and Buddhists of Vietnam who are not allowed to practice their faith whether communism is dead. And if communism is dead, why do so many college students here and abroad wear Che Guevara and hammer and sickle t-shirts? Our Jewish brothers and sisters understand full well what is at stake. They understand that history must not be forgotten, lest it be repeated. They keep reminding the world of the Holocaust, crying, "Never again." Even so, we cannot, we must not, we will not forget the victims of communism or their sacrifice for us. We will continue to tell the truth, and nothing but the truth, about Tiananmen Square, and the Gulag, and the Isle of Pines, and the killing fields of Cambodia, and the boat people of Vietnam and Cuba. Let us all here resolve that never again will we allow so evil a tyranny as communism to terrorize and subjugate the peoples and the nations of the world. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce three visiting parliamentarians from our good friends in the Baltic states. Andrunius Azubalis, who is Deputy Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Estonia. Marko Mikkelsen, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament. And Ožars Kalnins, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the Latvian Parliament. Gentlemen, if you will please come to the podium and make some brief remarks.
Dear friends, if any man disowned his past, he would be commanded to wander in the dark. The same destiny awaits also peoples who escape historical memory or aim to erase the memory or what may seem inconvenient according to today's understanding of benefit or loss. In my continent, everybody is aware of the crimes to humanity by Nazism, but only part of Europe is aware of the crimes of communism. As for Lithuania and our neighboring Baltic states, we have direct experience and bitter taste of Stalinist regime. Therefore, for us, communism is not an exotic or fancy idea of equality and freedom as imagined by some young people in Western Europe on these days, but just a platform for occupation, oppression, and terror. For this reason, Lithuania, accompanied by other Central and Eastern European states previously occupied by Soviet Union, initiated international discussions on historic conscience and memory at the EU level, and consistently support collaboration of research centers, academic institutions, and NGOs in their fight with amnesia of the communist crimes. For these aims, we managed to establish a common EU platform of European memory and conscience in 2011. 1 year later, on September 19, 2012, the resolution expressing support for designation of August 23 as Black Ribbon Day to recognize the victims of Soviet communist and Nazi regime was submitted in the United States Congress. Dear friends, I would like to use this special opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to Congressman Daniel Lundgren and Congressman John Shimkus for this courageous and important initiative, and hope that this resolution, or ones like it, will find its way by being re-registered and voted for in the 113th Congress. Dear friends, standing here in front of this monument, together with honorable, like-minded people, I bow my head in front of all the victims of communism worldwide. And on behalf of my fellow colleagues from Nordic Baltic region, let me assure all those who are still fighting their battles against authoritarian regimes, we understand and support your case. Thank you.
Every Latvian family in the world was affected by the deportations that took place in several waves, starting in 1941. Some were the direct victims of those deportations. They were sent to Siberia, most of whom never lived to return. Another group were the relatives of those who were deported, who somehow managed to survive, but continued to live with the scars and the legacy of those deportations. And there was another group of Latvians who somehow managed to escape to the West so they wouldn't be deported. I'm a product of that last group because my parents fled to the West after World War II. I was born in a displaced persons camp and eventually ended up here. And when I look at this monument, as much as I see it as a memorial to all those who died and who suffered, I also see it as a sign of hope. Because it was here in this country that the tens of thousands of Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians who managed to escape the terrorism of communism were able to try to rebuild the hope of reclaiming the independence of their countries. And thanks to the government of this country, that independence, that hope for independence was never abandoned. And thanks to the non-recognition policy of the United States of America, in 1991, when our people rose up again to reclaim that independence, we had a legal and a political basis to restore that independence. So that for me, this is a symbol of hope, not just for the rebirth of the 3 independent Baltic states, but I think it's a sign to all people who live under oppression, especially under communist oppression. But I think all oppression in the world is that you need support, you need allies, you need friends, but you have to believe in your people and you have to continue to fight in order to reclaim your lives and your right to exist on this planet. So I want to thank again everyone who supported us all those many years, 50 years, who never gave up hope. And I want to thank all those who are no longer with us, who were either sent to Siberia or who ended up here, never living to see the independence of Latvia restored again. I think they're with us now, and I think they will be with us in the generations to come. But we will never let this happen again. Thank you.
We all know that history is something what we cannot change. I studied history at the very historic moment for our nation. I went to the university in 1988 during Soviet Union times. We weren't sure how long Estonia will be under occupation, but we were sure that one day the freedom will be there again. And actually it came very quickly. In 1993, when I graduated university, I graduated already during free Estonia again. As a historian, and I said, like I said, we know that history is something that we cannot change. But we all know that history can be very powerful tool in the hands of those who try to manipulate of the minds of the people, of those minds who are not free and don't know what freedom means. I think so what our nations went through during the last 20, 30 years is extraordinary. And I think so this is what brings us together to commemorate these events, what actually something what we have to every day think about. Freedom, democracy is something what are very much valued among our nations, and we work daily to promote freedom and democracy where the people would like to be free and democratic, but they are not yet. So I think so these events like today here or somewhere else in the world are extremely important in a way, because we know that crimes of communism are not yet fully understood, and those who committed those crimes are not punished. But I think the most important what we can do is commemorate, talk and remember those victims who fell on the communist crimes. Once again, thank you for US Government, Congress to organize this event as well here and participate. We very much acknowledge your support during times when we were not free, but we are today free and among those nations who can help others. Thank you.
Would like to also recognize that we have here with us the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committees of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. It's now my pleasure to invite to the podium for some remarks a rising star of the U.S. Congress, Congressman Jim Bridenstine, from that wonderful, wonderful state, not of Arizona, though I am, but from Oklahoma, the heartland of America. The congressman is a Navy pilot, a combat veteran. After leaving active duty, became director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum. So we're going to have to call upon you, Congressman, to help us with our museum. He was elected to Congress in 2012. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Bridenstine.
Well, I would just like to start by thanking Dr. Edwards for inviting me, and thank you for all the dignitaries that are here from foreign nations. It is a true honor to be here, and I congratulate the foundation on its 6th anniversary for the memorial's dedication. I've got a number of remarks here planned, but I'd just like to share you my experience with communism. I'm a Navy pilot. I've flown combat all over this world over many years now, and one of my first experiences was an exercise I did in South Korea. And during that exercise, I took a day off and I went up to Panmunjom, where the armistice was signed between South Korea and North Korea in 1953. And I was at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, looking across the border from a watchtower, and I had a Japanese soldier with me. The Japanese soldier spoke English. Of course, he spoke Japanese and he spoke Korean very well. And he was interpreting a lot of what I was seeing. And one of the first things I noticed was a big city on the hill, a big city over the horizon there. And he was sharing with me that while the city looks beautiful from a distance, that inside this city, the buildings have no windows, the buildings have no floors, the buildings have no useful purpose whatsoever. The city was built as propaganda to encourage South Koreans to defect to North Korea. And this was an idea for a young lieutenant junior grade in the United States Navy. This was an idea that was completely foreign to me. The idea that you would build a fake city to try to encourage people to come to your country. The other thing that I saw and I heard, they had billboards. And the billboards said, "Come to North Korea, the land of opportunity." And at this time in North Korea, 5% of the population was starving to death every year. And they were saying, "Come to North Korea, the land of opportunity." The third thing I saw, or I actually heard from this watchtower, were loudspeakers coming from the north. And of course, the Japanese soldier was interpreting for me, and he said that the loudspeakers say, "Come to North Korea, our generals are better than your generals." And in America, I heard chuckles here. In America, that sounds funny to us. That's something that, again, is foreign to a young lieutenant junior grade in the Navy who's never been to the Korean Peninsula before. But what was so unique and what really struck me is the fact that here in the United States of America, we don't fight for generals. We don't fight for autocrats. And we don't fight for men. We fight for institutions. We fight for the Constitution. We fight for the rule of law. We fight for our Bill of Rights. We fight for the right to assemble, like we're doing here today. We fight for the freedom of speech, the opportunity for me to come here and say what I've seen and what I've been a part of. The freedom of speech, the right to assemble, the protections for political opposition is something that we hold dear. And the right to freely worship is something that is unique. It's not as unique as it used to be, thanks in a large part because freedom-loving people have made the ultimate sacrifices required to extend freedom around the world. But these concepts were unique, and it's important to note that when I was in South Korea, I went to church and I worshiped freely because somebody from my country had gone to that country, and a lot of those people had made the ultimate sacrifice. They gave everything so that people in a foreign nation would have the opportunity to live free. And what I think is so important about this foundation, certainly we want to remember and commemorate the victims of communism, absolutely. But I think what's equally important is the fact that we have new generations that are coming up, and people have alluded to Che Guevara and other cultural phenomenon that are going on inside the United States regarding communism. It is up to us to stand firm and let people know just the atrocities, the economic atrocities, the human rights atrocities that are associated with communism. It is up to us as political leaders to make sure that these atrocities never come to countries that currently live free. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who really, without him, we wouldn't be here. Back in 1993, when there was a congressional resolution to approve a memorial to the victims of communism, one member stood up very, very firmly and strongly and said, yes, it must be done. And that individual was Congressman Dana Rohrabacher of California. He's continued to speak out for freedom and democracy all over the world. So please welcome an old and dear and good friend of ours, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher.
Yeah, this just about didn't happen. I can tell you that I remember when Lev Dobryansky brought this up originally, and it was going to be a real struggle, and we were going to have a memorial and even maybe have a museum to the victims of communism. And people started emerging all over this city to fight Lev Dobryansky to prevent him from doing that. We had some real stalwarts behind our effort, and we were just lucky we had people like Tom Lantos, who are another hero in this fight in the Cold War, who are with us. But it actually took us, we had to make a deal in order to get this statue and this memorial actually done. And it was that the administration was going to go to Russia. They needed a certain piece of legislation to be rushed through the Foreign Affairs Committee. In order to do that, they needed to have unanimous consent to waive the rules, to have the time to get the legislation through. And I just stepped forward and said, no, I'm going to object unless we get a Victims of Communism memorial. And that's how we got it. And so that's, sometimes it's not just the great proclamations of principle and those type of huge stands that are being made against some onslaught that change the day, but sometimes it's people who are able to maneuver through a bureaucratic maze. And I will tell you that Tom Lantos, during that time, he did that for so many people who are seeking their freedom. And of course, Lev Dobryansky laid the intellectual foundation for what we're doing today. And then, of course, it took Lee Edwards, a hardened political activist who knew how to get things organized and get things done, before we actually were able to put the project and bring it to fruition. So today I'm here to thank all of those of you who were involved in this. And as we look at what this statue is and what this memorial is, it reminds us that the Cold War may be over, but the fight against communism goes on. this was never, and I know I'm making a lot of people mad at me when I say this was never a fight against Russia. This was a fight against communism that captured Russia just like other captive nations. And it is up to us to try to work with the Russian people to try to defeat the remnants of communism that still threaten the world. And especially, I say that, especially when we see that this statue is resembles the statue that was in Tiananmen Square, where the freedom-loving people of China were slaughtered and were ultimately denied what the people of Russia got, which was the elimination of communism. Perhaps the greatest tragedy in my lifetime is that at Tiananmen Square, the United States did nothing to suggest to the Chinese leadership they weren't going to get away with this. I will tell you right now, this did not happen under Ronald Reagan's watch. Under Ronald Reagan's watch, communism was disintegrating because that was his #1 goal, was to defeat the Soviet Union. Again, not Russia, the Soviet Union. And when Reagan left office, and I'm very, very proud to have served as one of Ronald Reagan's speechwriters for 7 years of my life. That's probably the thing that I'm the proudest of in my entire life. But when Reagan left office, this Tiananmen Square was ready to happen, but Ronald Reagan was not president. And I've told this many times, I think if Ronald Reagan would have been president, we'd have had a different world today, and communism would not be the dominant force in China, and thus China would not be threatening the world peace. The fact is that when Tiananmen, and people say, what would Reagan have done? Would he have sent in the troops? No. What Ronald Reagan would have done is when we knew that the troops were amassing to go into Tiananmen Square and slaughter the democracy movement, Ronald Reagan would have picked up the phone or sent a telegram saying, if you do this, no more economic investment in your country, no more transfer of technologies and capital, no more open market to your goods, the deal is off. That's what Reagan would have said. And they wouldn't have invaded. But what did, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say bad things about Republicans, but what did Ronald Reagan's Republican successor say? Nothing! He said nothing! And that was the greatest message of all, because they went into Tiananmen Square and they slaughtered the democracy movement, and you know what price they paid? Nothing! Of course the communists, if we would have had that policy during Ronald Reagan's era, the Soviet Union would still be alive and well and dominating all of Eastern Europe and still threatening the peace of the world. Thank God we had Ronald Reagan when we had him, and we're looking around for another one this next time out too. And finally, let me just note that today I see Ronald Reagan saw the Soviet Union as the greatest threat. That was his target. If we are going to succeed, we need to understand that today, radical Islam, which is at our throats, murdering our people, that and China have to be our #1 goals in to trying to defeat those forces on this planet. If we just saying we're going to be against everything that's bad isn't going to do it. We've got to make sure that we make the alliances and do what's necessary to defeat this dual threat to all of us and all of mankind. You know, we remember the people who fought today, victims of, and those who died. We remember the victims. We also remember those who struggled to make sure that the victimization of human beings ended. And there were many such people. I'm going to tell you one story, and then I'm going to get off of here because I know I'm tired of Dana Rohrabacher. But the fact is that when I was a young man, when I was a 9-year-old boy, I lived in Japan. My father was a Marine pilot. He flew spy missions along the China coast. We were in a little enclave outside a city at a little base called Iwakuni. And there was this little compound, and we were there with other families of people who were flying spy missions along the coast of Japan, of China. So we were a tight-knit group of families there, and right across the little dirt road from my family was another family, a pilot, who, when he was flying his missions, my dad wasn't flying, and I remember them very well because they had a little monkey, and their kids were my age. We used to play together. And then one day I came back, and the family was in tears. It was havoc and chaos. And I still remember this as a 9-year-old boy, because the father, the pilot, was shot down doing one of his missions near the Chinese coastline, and he was shot down. And of course, in the annals of military history, he is in the record as his plane crashed because of mechanical difficulties. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of Americans who lost their lives during the Cold War. We know about the ones who lost their lives overtly in Vietnam and Korea and elsewhere where we fought. We know that. But there were others, there's so many others that did the job that needed to be done and paid the price, and their names aren't even on the record now. We remember all of these people, and we know that as long as America is a force for freedom in the world, freedom, the people who love freedom have a chance against their tyrants. Let us recommit ourselves to what this is, and remember, until there is freedom in China, this lovely lady will remind us that the victims of communism will never be revenged until there is freedom in China. God bless you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're now honored to have the former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. Congress, Eliana Ross-Layton, born in Cuba, who understands so very well how important it is to keep raising a standard to encourage and to inspire the people of Cuba to realize that one day they will be free as well. Please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Eliana Ross-Layton.
Well, thank you very much. What great speeches my congressional colleagues have made. I am so pleased to be here at this important event. Good to see our ambassadors and our freedom fighters from around the world. This is indeed an important occasion. So many people devoted to freedom, devoted to democracy, and it was an honor for me to have received the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom from this terrific organization a few years ago. And I want to thank the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation for its incredible work, for its dedicated service to making this annual event possible. And I want to congratulate Dr. Yang Li for receiving this hard-earned and prestigious award. Just last week, as Dana pointed out, we remembered and commemorated the hundreds of brave Chinese students who were killed by the ruthless army on June 4th, 1989 at Tiananmen Square. So it is fitting that we honor Dr. Jian Li, a survivor of this brutal massacre. Well-deserved honor. And I also, along with my colleagues, I want to give a good shout out to my wonderful friend, Annette Lantos, who is such a freedom fighter, such a proud promoter of democracy around the world. I had the unique gift and pleasure and honor to serve as the ranking member, as her husband, the late Tom Lantos, chaired a very bipartisan committee at that time, our Foreign Affairs Committee, and there was no greater voice for freedom, for democracy, and for anti-communism than the voice of Tom Lantos, and we miss him dearly, Annette, so I know that you do as well, but you're carrying on his mission. Let's give it up for Annette Lantos. As you heard, I'm a victim of communism myself, so I understand the horrors that this misguided ideology has brought to the 11 million people enslaved in my native homeland, and it continues to bring terrible outcomes to millions of people around the world. While some people demanding freedom were able to overcome communism in Germany and in Poland and so many previously enslaved lands, many regimes, such as the one in my native homeland of Cuba, in North Korea, in Vietnam, and China, continue to oppress their own people and violate daily, systematic basis. And just like so many victims of communism, my family had to flee communist Cuba and start a new life of freedom and democracy in this wonderful United States of America. And luckily for us, you know, some people don't have this great fortune. We were able to come to the United States, where freedom and democracy help provides bottomless opportunities for people of all backgrounds to fulfill and achieve any dream. And I know that that's true because I came here when I was only 8 years old, did not speak a word of English, and to think that an 8-year-old refugee girl with no English skills could rise and become the first Hispanic female of the United States Congress, and then being able to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee says all you need to know about the greatness and the opportunities that are available to everyone in this great country that we call home. And Tom and I, in the time that he was the chairman and I was the top Republican, the ranking member, we would always comment on the greatness of America, that here we are, two naturalized Americans, because Tom Lantos was not born here. I, as you know, I was not born here. Two naturalized Americans were in a committee where we set forth the foreign policy goals of the United States Congress. Is this a great country or what? Amazing. And as Dana pointed out, the Cold War may be over for historians, but let us not forget that the fight against communism is far from over, and much work still needs to be done. Just look at the tremendous differences that we see between countries led by communist regimes in the former East Germany, the current North Korea, and the countries of the same peoples living under freedom and democracy in the former West Germany and the current South Korea. What a stark difference you can see there. When comparing South Korea to North Korea, it takes less than the blink of an eye to see the stark differences between communism and freedom. South Korea's freedom and democracy grants its citizens limitless opportunities. North Koreans, meanwhile, are starving while their leaders live in luxury. And it wasn't too long ago when President Reagan said those famous words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," as he stood in Berlin facing that horrid wall that separated families, separated loved ones between the worlds of freedom and the world of dictatorships. And still, even with the great efforts and much money that was invested into East German cities, there's still a clear difference in the quality of life in East Germany, causing many young people to flock to the former West German cities to seek better jobs and opportunities. It takes a long time for countries to recuperate from being shackled under the chains of communism. And I also want to say some brief remarks about the ongoing human rights violations occurring in communist regimes such as Vietnam and China. Just last week, I had the privilege to meet with leaders of the Vietnamese American community on Capitol Hill. As a Cuban American, I so identify with their concerns and their deep sorrow. Just like in Cuba, the regime, dissidents, and activists, they routinely face harassment. They face intimidation. They face imprisonment in Vietnam, same as in my native homeland of Cuba. So I have continued to press the State Department to list Vietnam as a country of particular concern. That's the category that they use. Why? Because Vietnam has a complete disregard for human rights. And I'm a proud sponsor of a bill in Congress, House Resolution 218, that calls for that designation. And regarding China, I hope that the President took the opportunity last week at that summit to bring up the gross human rights abuses that are committed each day under the brutal communist regime when he met with the leader of China. We always like to talk about the great economic accomplishments of China. Those people are living under an authoritarian rule. They may have limited economic freedoms, but there is no freedom until you have human rights respected and true freedoms respected. In China, you have religious intolerance. You have arbitrary and unjust court procedures. And not to talk about the forced abortions that are being committed, crimes against women every day in China's one-child policy that its rulers say doesn't exist. It doesn't exist if you have the money to pay your way out of that coercive policy, but it continues to be imposed upon women against their will. Now that's an inconvenient truth, and we want to look away because it's more comfortable for us to look away. But these abusive policies can't go ignored. We've got to face them. And while we continue to help those living under oppressive communist regimes throughout the globe, we must not forget about the people in our own hemisphere. As a victim of the Castro regime, I'm very concerned when I walk around college campuses and I see these young people with T-shirts of Che Guevara and the Castro brothers. You see it in Europe, you see it throughout the world, but you see it right here in our wonderful country. And I'm all for freedom of expression. They can wear those T-shirts, no problem in wearing them, no problem in selling them. But every time I see a young person with that T-shirt of Che Guevara, I stop and I ask them, do you know what this murderous thug has done throughout our hemisphere? Do you know how many people he relished killing? Not just in Cuba, but in so many other countries. So I'm always shocked that the students will wear these T-shirts, but I'm never hesitant to call them out on it and at least make them feel a little bit chagrined so that they know that if they were to wear a T-shirt that Che Guevara would not have agreed with, Che Guevara would have just killed that person, as he did so many others. He was a sadistic, bloodthirsty tyrant. And throughout the last couple of months, I've had the opportunity to meet with pro-democracy advocates who've come from Cuba. They've come here to Washington with the same message, that the Cuban people are striving and doing everything that they can against an oppressive regime, and they're crying out for freedom, and they're no longer afraid. And these courageous individuals need our support. They expect some solidarity and our admiration, and I hope that each and every one of you will become more familiar with these new faces. These are the leaders of a free, democratic Cuba, and they are in jail, and they are beaten up, and they are harassed. People like the ladies in white. That is the future of a free Cuba. So we must stand in solidarity with pro-democracy advocates wherever they are, whether it's in Vietnam, whether it's in China, whether it's in Cuba, because these individuals are involved in a daily struggle against tyranny, against a brutal dictatorship that stops at nothing to hold on to power, and they will squash any dissent and anyone speaking out. And it's a moral obligation for all of us who live in freedom and democracy and enjoy all of these liberties to help people around the world attain the freedom and the democracy so that all of us can live in an environment in which we can pursue the basic rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it is also in our national security interest to eradicate communism once and for all from the face of the earth. As a strong supporter of human rights, individual liberties, freedoms, and a fellow victim of communism, I pledge my utmost support as a member of Congress to ensure that freedoms and liberties that sometimes we take so lightly and sometimes we take for granted can ultimately be spread everywhere. Let no corner be living under communism on this great earth. Muchísimas gracias, muy agradecida. Annette, it's a joy to see you, my friend. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mrs. Annette Lantos. So much has already been said about her. I will just say this, that this event would not be the same without her. We look to her for inspiration, for leadership, for instruction, for education. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mrs. Annette Lantos.
I'm probably the oldest member here. Probably, I don't know, maybe the only one who actually suffered many years under communism personally. So all these proceedings are very, very meaningful. Is there anybody else who lived under communism in the audience? Yes. Good. These are not the only one. So you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, I'm very grateful that you gather here to remember the victims of communism and not to allow us ever to forget. I'm honored very much to join you on this important occasion as we remember and honor the untold millions who died as victims of a brutal ideology. In the not too distant past, which held sway over much of the world, communism to many of you now seems like a remote relic. To many of people nowadays, it's not an issue anymore. But to those of us who were survivors and witnesses of the past century and of the communism itself, as well as of Nazism, the lessons of that time remain deeply relevant. We are all too aware of the dangers of forgetting the great battle for the future that played itself out across the continents, and that is why this memorial is so very important. During the Cold War, when I lived in Hungary, the stakes could not have been higher, nor the contrast more stark. The values of freedom, democracy, and human rights stood in opposition to the repression and totalitarianism of the Soviets. One of the most powerful symbols of the bankruptcy of communism could be seen in the Berlin Wall. The first time in history that a nation had built a wall not to keep its enemies out, but to keep its own people locked in. From Stalin's purges to China's Cultural Revolution to the killing fields of Cambodia, the true nature of communism stands revealed. The unprecedented number of victims that have been claimed, and sadly, such tragedies are not entirely of the past. Communist North Korea today is the most horrible example of a repressive, violent, and failed society in which millions have died as a result of famine and millions more imprisoned by brutal detention and re-education camps. China has abandoned its pretenses of economic egalitarianism and socialism, but it retains its iron grip and political power through the total domination of the Chinese Communist Party, and like the Berlin Wall of the past, seeks to keep its citizens locked away from the free world of ideas and even of the internet, infamous Great Firewall of China. Truly, as the French say, the plus ça change, the plus ça l'amène. The more it changes, the more it is the same. As you know, my late husband, Tom Lantos, was the only member of Congress who had personally lived under the political repression of both the Nazis of the right and the communists of the left. That is why he was so passionate about the preeminent importance of freedom and democracy, and why he was so proud to support the establishment of this remarkable monument. Tom was a great student of history, and he often quoted the famous words of George Santayana, who said, "Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it." Threats to our fundamental values of freedom and democracy continue to abound today. They take the form of terrorism, radical and violent Islamic extremism, and the return to authoritarianism and political intimidation in Putin's Russia. This is no time for us to turn our backs on the lessons of history. On the contrary, we must redouble our efforts to make sure that the current generation knows about the past so they can be prepared for the future. Tom often reminded us that the veneer of civilization is paper thin. We are its guardians and we can never rest. I want to thank all of you to standing guard over our collective memory and for never resting in your efforts to protect our freedom and civilization. Thank you.
It is no accident that the center of the Victims of Communism Memorial stands a bronze replica of the Goddess of Democracy, erected by pro-democracy Chinese students in Tiananmen Square in June.
Thank you all for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Louis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house as we prepare to begin, if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off. It would be appreciated by those recording the event. And our program internet viewers are always welcome to send us questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion is Dr. Lee Edwards, widely regarded as the historian of the American conservative movement. He is our distinguished fellow in conservative thought in the B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. Dr. Edwards, of course, is also chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and is an adjunct professor of politics at the Catholic University of America. He's authored over 20 books, including biographies of President Reagan, Senator Goldwater, and R. Ed Meese, as well as histories not only of Heritage, but the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. His newest book was Leading the Way, the story of Ed Fulmer and the Heritage Foundation. He has previously served as the founding director of the Institute on Political Journalism at Georgetown and has been a visiting fellow at the Institute of Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Lee Edwards. Lee.
Well, thank you, John, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I recognize some of you were at the ceremony earlier today, just an hour ago, at the Victims of Communism Memorial. I think we're all agreed it's a little more comfortable here. Okay. And there will be refreshments following this panel discussion. Well, let me begin by asking this question. What do the following have in common? A bronze bust of Joseph Stalin at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. The KGB bar in New York City's Greenwich Village. Che Guevara t-shirts on dozens of American campuses. A high school marching band in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, waving hammer and sickle placards and celebrating St. Petersburg 1917. I'm not making this up here. What they have in common and what they reveal is a shocking ignorance about the victims and crimes of communism, a global Holocaust numbering more than 100 million victims. And the fact that communism is not dead, but alive and all too well in China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. Now, we have assembled a distinguished panel this afternoon to examine the legacy of communism. Now, this is not an academic exercise, but a public policy affecting, for example, the two largest economies in the world. An isolated totalitarian regime with nuclear ambitions. A hostile government unwilling, despite 5 decades of abject failure, to abandon its dreams of a socialist utopia. The United States, I think we would agree, and should agree, cannot have realistic relations with the communist regimes of China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Laos, unless we understand the role of communism in their strategic, political, and economic decisions, as well as those of countries such as Russia, shaped and molded for decades by Marxism-Leninism. Our first speaker is not listed on your program, but it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Len Latkovsky, Professor of History and International Studies at Hood College, who called to our attention the fact that this is the 60th anniversary of the Norilsk and Vorkuta revolts in the Soviet Gulag. The bravery of those who stood up to the Soviet regime was remarkable, and we have asked Professor Latkovsky to say a few words about those 1953 revolts. Professor?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. This year marks the 60th anniversary of massive revolts at the Norilsk and Vorkuta Gulag forced labor camps in 1953. At this very moment, middle of June, 60 years ago, at the 20-plus camps in Vorkuta, 20-plus camps in Norilsk, all of the camps went on strike. Well, they'd gone on strike a couple weeks earlier. They were still on strike. These uprisings put in motion the steps that led eventually to the end of the Gulag. The revolts were staged by prisoners, unjustly arrested and sentenced to slave labor in the Gulag. They were from many different nationalities. They demanded better conditions, fair treatment, and they refused to work until conditions improved. Their decision to strike threatened the basis of the Stalinist economy, which relied heavily on slave labor. The Norilsk complex produced nickel, platinum, and many other highly valued metals. The Vorkuta mines, coal mines, produced 1/12 of the entire coal production of the USSR and the entire supply for Leningrad. 60 years later, the historic significance of these revolts remains great, but unfortunately, the knowledge is not so extensive. The uprisings were a clear sign of the long-standing internal opposition to the Soviet communist system. An American prisoner at Vorkuta, John Noble, who survived the uprising, called it the Great Vorkuta Slave Rebellion. Jānis Zīle, a Latvian participant, said it proved that prisoners were able to unite and challenge an inhumane system. Alexander Solzhenitsyn remarked, the Stalinist camp system, particularly these special regime camps, was nearing a crisis. Now, worker protests revolts, rebellions had occurred from the very beginning in the 30s, but they were sporadic, they were small scale. This was the first time that an entire complex went on strike. The Soviet leadership had never seen anything like this. The world had never seen anything like this. And this was partly due to the creation of the special regime camps in 1948, an idea that backfired because in these camps, the most active and energetic Ukrainian, Baltic, and other nationals were placed. So in May, and in fact in late 1952 in Karaganda, the beginnings of revolts began. 1,200 prisoners were transferred from there to Norilsk and Vorkuta. In late May, in Norilsk, the revolt began. The camp authorities were stunned. They tried in vain to coax the prisoners back to work. The revolt continued the entire summer. Political prisoners proved their organizational ability, their discipline, their solidarity. They created strike committees. They formed reasonable demands, which were basic human rights. And the Ukrainians were the majority in the camps, but all nationalities took part. Sympathy strike, and the word spread quickly to other parts of the Gulag, and sympathy strikes spread. One of the amazing events, which is a story in itself at Norilsk, is the Women's Camp number 6, which early on joined in the revolt. And here again you have Ukrainian leaders like Lesya Zelenskaya and Maria Nich, and then 3 Baltic heroines, the Estonian Asta Tofri, the Latvian Alida Dauge, and the Lithuanian Irena Martinkute Smetanione. They went on a hunger strike for 2 weeks, and then eventually their revolt was put down most brutally. At Norilsk, camp number 3 held out the longest. By mid-June, many of the camps had gone back to work. Camp 3 held out. And again, we have heroes like the Russian Boris Shemayev and the Russian Leon Doronin, the Ukrainian Konstantin Koral, and the Latvian Alexander Valyums, and the Lithuanian Jožas Kazlauskas, and many, many more. The Norilsk revolt was put down brutally with a bloody repression, killing hundreds and wounding hundreds. Simultaneously with the Norilsk revolt, a revolt broke out at Vorkuta. I'm going to summarize here and mainly say, again, massive revolt, same kinds of demands, freedom or death. That was the slogan. On August 2nd, a massacre at Camp 29, the last one to hold out, occurred. Put down by the top authorities in the Soviet Union, ordered by Krugloff in Moscow, Sergei Krugloff, but on the scene was NKVD General Maslennikov and the Procurator General Roman Rudenko. They were in charge as the prisoners were mowed down by machine guns. So, in conclusion, we need to know better the events of the Gulag, the history of the camps. Some effort has been made by heroic people, by objective historians, but the Russian government has failed to do its part and has ignored the history of the Gulag, and not only that, but now is threatening the Society of Memorial. Each year, the survivors of the Vorkuta uprising commemorated the event. On August 1st, at Mine 29, they erected a small memorial to the fallen. Solzhenitsyn writes, near the slag heap at Pit 29, somebody in Khrushchev's day raised a cross with a tall stem like a telegraph pole on the common grave. Then it was knocked down, and somebody put it up again. Others have told us Vorkuta inmates, whatever their nationality, observed August 1st as their day of mourning. Every year since, Vorkuta people pin a black ribbon to their miner's dress as a sign of undying solidarity and loyalty to their fallen comrades. So on this day, let us remember these victims of communism, the courageous men and women who took part in the revolts, which are among the most momentous events in the history of Soviet communism.
Thank you so much, Professor. Our second speaker this afternoon is going to be Bruce Klinger, a Senior Research Fellow in Northeast Asia for Heritage's Asian Studies Center. A former employee of the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Klinger brings more than a quarter of a century of experience to his analysis of North Korea and its neighbors. He's a frequent contributor to U.S. and foreign media and holds, I am told, a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo and a first-degree black belt in Hapkido. I'm sure I didn't pronounce those correctly, but Bruce, please.
Thank you very much, Lee. This is the face of evil. This is the face of a national security threat to the country. These are human scum, or so North Korea would have you believe. What it is a picture of is 9 North Korean refugees who sought freedom in South Korea. Over a year ago, they escaped from North Korea. They made their way into northeast China, where they lived for a year. And then more recently, with the aid of a minister and his wife, made it across China into Laos, where they were captured by Laotian authorities. The Laotian authorities turned them over to North Korean security services, and they were forcibly repatriated via China to North Korea. They made their way via an underground railroad which had otherwise enabled a number of refugees to make it to South Korea or even to the United States. This is a picture taken earlier when they were still in China. The signs they hold in Korean say Merry Christmas. When they go back, we don't know what fate awaits them. Under North Korean law, leaving the country without permission is treason, and the minimal sentence is 5 years at hard labor. The 9 refugees here, along with several others who actually made it to freedom, are 15 to 22 years old, although I think they look even younger, 2 girls and 7 boys. Those in the Gulag face a constant threat of torture and arbitrary execution. And often 3 generations of a family are sent to the North Korean gulags for the crimes of one. And the crime can be simply criticizing the great leader. This picture, I think, is iconic, and it really shows the situation in Northeast Asia. What we have is, in 2002, 5 North Korean refugees sought freedom by getting onto the grounds of the Japanese consulate in Shenyang in northeast China. And what we have is North Koreans struggling, literally, to reach freedom. And we have Chinese security officials preventing them from getting onto the grounds of the Japanese consulate. The young girl, the 2-year-old, was on the back of the mother, and she fell into the grounds of the consulate as her mother struggled. And the Chinese officials not only took the mother into captivity, but came onto the grounds of the Japanese consulate, took the 2-year-old, as well as 3 North Korean refugees who had made it into the building of the consulate, obviously violating diplomatic laws and rules. I think the face of this 2-year-old really should be seared into the conscience of the world. It reflects what is going on in North Korea, and it reflects the willingness to endure harsh punishment, even death, to try to reach freedom. And really, she is a poster child for the victims of communism. Now, what are they fleeing? Well, this is what North Korea would have you believe. Well-fed children, adoring the great leaders Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un. And the children are taught really from birth that everything they receive is a gift from the great leader. There's a film where it shows a Western eye doctor who went into North Korea and performed cataract surgery on a number of North Koreans. And there's part of the film where when the bandages are first removed from the North Korean's eyes and he can see again, the first thing he does, he doesn't thank the doctor. He goes over to a picture of Kim Jong-il and thanks the great leader for restoring his vision. Now, this is the fantasy. This is the reality. This is not a picture of Buchenwald. This is not a picture from Auschwitz. This is not a picture from Dachau or a Soviet gulag. This is North Korea, and this is today. Stalin once said that one death is a tragedy, and 1 million deaths is a statistic. Well, in the mid-1990s, at least 1 million North Koreans died of starvation and starvation-related diseases, in large part because 25% of North Korea's budget goes to its military. And then an additional percentage goes to thousands of statues throughout the country of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, and also exorbitant celebrations. And also the recent launch of a North Korean missile in December, the cost of that, people said, they estimated it could have fed the country for a year. And the situation since the photo was taken has not improved significantly. There's still dire starvation and just really dire economic situation. Now, people ask, who are the victims of communism? These are the victims of communism. This is today. This is not ancient history. This is not even a photo from the last century. This is what's going on in North Korea. An estimated 100,000 to 200,000 are in these political gulags. Some of them are literally the size of the District of Columbia. You can see them on imagery. And there have been a number of books that have come out detailing the atrocities that occur here. Forced abortions, medical experimentation, executions, torture, etc. One recent book by the former Washington Post correspondent in Asia, Blaine Harden, called Escape from Camp 14. It details the story of someone who was born in one of these camps, grew up in these camps. He turned in his mother and his brother for violating the rules because he thought that's what you do. That's what he grew up with. One of the stories he tells is that during his hard labor in these camps, one day he came across a pile of horse manure, and in it was some undigested corn. And he said that was one of the best days of his life because on that day he got to eat corn. This is the situation in these gulags. Now, if North Korea could speak to the world, what would they say? Save my family, save my friends, save my people. And what can we do? Well, remember the photo I showed you of that 2-year-old? That actually has a happy ending. What happened is after the Chinese officials went in and took all 5 of the North Korean refugees and held them hostage, what had happened was that part of a non-government organization had alerted the South Korean media to what was about to happen at the consulate. So the South Korean media filmed that entire episode, and the film was shown repeatedly in South Korea and Japan, and it generated intense international criticism and pressure on China. Eventually, China allowed the release of the 5 refugees, and they made it to South Korea. And that 2-year-old girl eventually visited George Bush when he was president in 2006. So the story is that, yes, things are terrible in North Korea, beyond imagination, and yet international pressure can occasionally bring about a happy ending. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind, is that international pressure can and should be kept not only on North Korea, but on China, which facilitates the return of the refugees back into a doomed existence. And so that's the message. This is not old. This is not ancient history. We can do things if we stand up against tyranny and fight for freedom. Thank you very much.
Ariel Cohen is the Senior Research Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. Dr. Cohen, who joined Heritage in 1992, has published widely, provided incisive commentary on every major U.S. TV and radio network, plus all 3 national TV channels in Russia. Received his Ph.D. from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and when one wants the truth about what's going on in Russia, one turns to Dr. Ariel Cohen.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thank you for leading the foundation that keeps memory of those millions of victims. But for me, it's not millions. For me, it's very personal. In April, I was in Yekaterinburg, formerly Sverdlovsk, in Russia, in the Ural Mountains. One of the locations they took me was a cathedral, as they say in Russian, built on blood. It was built on the blood of the last emperor and the royal family. And while the emperor is a very controversial figure, and this is not a history exercise, the faces of his children, the faces of the princesses and of the hemophiliac heir to the throne, Alexei, really get to you despite the gaudy architecture of that cathedral. But more importantly, the hosts took me outside of Sverdlovsk, almost as an afterthought. They said, oh, you probably don't want to see it. And this is a memorial built in the killing fields outside of Yekaterinburg with 18,000 names of people executed in these godforsaken woods 6-7 miles outside, 12 kilometers outside of the city, just in the period of 1937-38, the Great Purge. Think about millions who did not even receive the mere memorialization of their names on a slab of concrete, because 5 million were killed in the Civil War, about 5 million died in the collectivization when they forced the agriculture to become collective farms. And that period of 36, 37, 38 is personal for me because a month later in May, I was in Astana in Kazakhstan in the presidential office, in the presidential administration. And the chief of staff of the president brought 2 old files and handed them to me. And in one of them, it said, the handwritten confession of David Kogan, my grandfather, who was executed soon after he gave those confessions. I'll leaf through that. He said, oh, you want me to declassify it and give you the copies? I said, sure, of course. Oh, I just want to check. And I said, leaf through, and I was like hit by a train. Because you see ink on paper, your own grandfather's handwriting. And he confesses of things he could not possibly commit. He was an industrial manager. He was an economic planner in that communist economy. He was a newspaper editor. How could he possibly be involved in spread of foot and mouth disease as a part of the Trotskyite Bukharinite conspiracy? How could they try to bankrupt the Soviet Union? And you see the handwriting deteriorating sheet after sheet, because he was beaten, because he was tortured, because he was sleep deprived. And then he writes, I'm giving this confession under duress in a meager hope that the party will spare my life. So whatever he said there was just as a man hoped that they would not put a bullet in his neck, and they did. Roll credits 70 years later. What do we have? We have the collapse of communism that I frankly did not expect to live long enough to see. We have the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, but we also see a missed opportunity. Russia missed an opportunity to build a modern, law-based society and a democratic system of government. This is for several reasons. First, there was no lustration. Lustration is opening the archives, identifying who was a part of that repressive system, be it high-ranking members of the Communist Party or members of the secret police, and asking those ladies and gentlemen to no longer rule the people they brought to perdition. If they want to do business, fine. If they want to do something else, fine. If they want to leave the country, fine. But do not engage in government. Russia did not do it. Other countries in the Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states, did not do it. As a result, we have a stinted civil society. We have the court system that cannot provide the necessary foundations for a law-based economy that denies investment, causes investment flight outside of Russia. Hundreds of billions of dollars were evacuated from Russia, and this also prevents people from investing from abroad unless it is oil and gas and other raw materials. The third reason they missed an opportunity is that they did not manage to replace the ideology of communism with the norms, the freedoms, and the values that we take for granted, or we were taking for granted in this country until the latest series of scandals makes me wonder, are we taking them for granted, and are these values under attack? So they replaced the ideology of communism with what? With nationalism, with neo-imperialism, with xenophobia. They turned the Orthodox Church, that was deeply penetrated by the secret services, into an ideological department of the government. And taken together, we have a return, not to Stalin's Soviet Union, not to the dictatorship, but probably of something even more primeval. You have today, essentially in Russia, the triad, the trifecta of православие, самодержавие, народность, Russian Orthodoxy, autocracy, and populism with national overtones. You have today the attempts to return the cult of Joseph Stalin, not as it was in his day, with statues and busts at every corner in Virginia, but sneaking the description of Stalin, the narrative that Stalin was an effective manager, sneaking it into history books. Mr. Putin ordered one history textbook to be produced, and now the question is, how much coverage the Stalin's repressions, like we heard about the Vorkuta camps and the Norilsk camps and the Karaganda camps, and all these camps where people, to use a Russian expression, were ground into a camp dust. How much kids today would know about it if there was one paragraph? Mistakes were made. You can't cook an omelet without breaking the eggs. When you cut trees, the chips flow, etc. So today, people who fight for civil society and for human rights take their own life into their hands. The crusading journalist Anna Politkovskaya was murdered in the entrance of her own building. Chechen human rights activist Natalia Stemirova was gunned down. Someone I personally knew, Novaya Gazeta editor Yuri Shikachikhin, was poisoned, and the list is long. Today, there are political prisoners in Russia. Alexei Navalny, the whistleblower and a politician, is awaiting a trial on trumped-up criminal charges of embezzlement, but there are 4 more cases being cranked against him. recently a Russian economist, a prominent economist, part of the establishment, Sergei Guriev, founder of the new economic school, was forced to emigrate. He was called and called again for interrogations about what? About an expert opinion he provided in the case of a man you heard about, most probably, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the founder of the Yukos oil company. After 2 prison sentences that are lasting over 10 years, now the rumor is the government is preparing the 3rd case against Khodorkovsky for paying experts and allegedly influencing the outcome of his appeal through paying the experts, and Guriev was dragged into that when he denies and others deny that Guriev took any money from Khodorkovsky, who, as I said, is currently in jail over 10 years and is supposed to walk next year. Guriev left. Another person you may have heard of, who also is forced to emigrate, is the chess player Garry Kasparov, the chess champion, who spoke here at the Heritage Foundation. So what we see here is the crackdown on the civil society by people who came out of the system of secret police and of communist-style law enforcement. And as long as this continues, as long as Lenin is in his mausoleum, this mummified monster in the middle of the Red Square, in the heart of Moscow, as long as Stalin is buried in the Kremlin wall, I do not see how Russia can shake off the legacy of communism. What can we do? I'm testifying tomorrow before a Senate subcommittee on Europe, and what I'm going to say is that we cannot just walk away from our responsibility for human freedom, for human condition. America always was an example, the shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan said. And we can use the bullet pulpit of the presidency, but do you hear Barack Obama talking about violations of human rights in Russia, or for that matter, in other parts of the world? In North Korea, in Cuba, in the Arab world, in Iran. I do not hear that, and I think that silence speaks 1,000 words. What else can we do? There is a piece of legislation called the Magnitsky List. Sergei Magnitsky was a lawyer and an accountant who worked for American-born British businessman William Browder, the grandson of Earl Browder, who made hundreds of millions of billions of dollars investing. Magnitsky was murdered. He was killed in one of these prisons in which hundreds of people were, thousands of people were murdered during Stalin's time. He was killed, he was denied health care, he was beaten, he was tortured because he refused to give evidence, false evidence, against his employer. And Browder and others lobbied Congress to pass a law that will nail down those who are responsible, not just for Sergei Magnitsky's death, but also for other systemic and gross violations of human rights in Russia. So we need to examine, are all the people who have to be on that list are in the list? My understanding is that the administration and the State Department are not happy about that piece of legislation and narrowed the list to about 18 names. What else can we do? We can reform our public broadcasting, our international broadcasting. The amounts of money we spend on the radios are much, much less than we used to, even in the tail end of the Cold War. The quality, the technology, the management, the personnel are all much, much to be desired, and it's a new environment where, in a place like Russia, there's a lot of media and you have to compete. It wasn't like everybody tuned into the Voice of America, Radio Liberty in the good old days, because this was the monopoly on truth. There's no longer a monopoly on truth in Russia, and you have to be very competitive, very creative, and probably not hire some of the latest hires that people came to regret. And okay, said enough. So we can do that. We can engage the Russians who are committed to human rights, who are committed to civil society, even after the draconian law was passed that banned all American funding to any kind of nonprofit, non-government organization in Russia. Any kind of NGO now, if it takes money from America, has to register as a foreign agent. And in the Soviet and Russian context, a foreign agent means that it's somebody who will be prosecuted, somebody whose rights will be denied, somebody who will be punished. And today, there were hundreds and hundreds of inspections where secret police, state accounting services, firefighters, and other regulators descended on these NGOs and checked everything from what kind of bulbs they have, do they have smallpox vaccinations, so harassed them. And I do not want to compare it to harassment of nonprofit organizations in this country that somebody didn't like. Okay. So we still need to work with these people, we need to support these people, we need to provide them with opportunity to make their words heard, as we did with Andrei Sakharov, with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, with Joseph Brodsky, who was a poet laureate of this country after he was pushed into immigration. And I think that the connection that we have with people who fight for freedom in Russia is deep and strong. Mstislav Rostropovich, the friend of Solzhenitsyn, who stood by him and endangered his career and had to immigrate after that, was the music director and conductor of the National Symphony here. I mentioned Brodsky, who was appointed by Reagan as a poet laureate. So you have people like that, and you have a lot of back and forth between the United States and Russia. And in the end of the day, of course, this is up to the Russians, what country they want, what society they want. What we should do, all we can, to remember the victims of communism, to draw lessons and conclusions for ourselves. First and foremost, it's for our freedom in this country, and also to support those who stand for freedom in Russia. Thank you very much.
My apologies to everyone. I have another meeting here at Heritage that I have to attend, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for making that contribution and for that PowerPoint on North Korea. Jose Cardenas is an associate at Vision Americas and one of the most knowledgeable analysts in Washington about inter-American affairs. Served in senior positions in the State Department, the National Security Council, AID, the OAS, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Like our other panelists, he's appeared on CNN, Fox News, and National Public Radio. He received his master's degree from Georgetown University, and he, too, has been someone to whom we can turn to if we want to know what is really happening, not only in Cuba, but throughout Latin America. Jose?
Thank you, Lee. And I also want to lend my profound gratitude to Lee Edwards for his dedication and his commitment to keeping this project alive. I wanted to pick up on something Lee said at the top of his comments, where he referred to the shocking ignorance of so many Americans about the cost, the toll that communism has taken on populations around the world. And I want to take that comment a step further and add to it that, and I'm sure Lee would absolutely agree, that part of the problem is that our understanding of communism, our knowledge of communism, has been so corrupted by the efforts of so many to whitewash the historical record and to continue to this day, even as the younger generations coming through that did not grow up with the image of the wall, had no understanding, appreciation for what the wall meant, still today are being victimized by the efforts of so many to distort the historical record. And with that in mind, I just wanted to refer to a couple of recent incidents that I encountered, how it happens to this very day. And I want to, if you all will just indulge me for a second, I'm making the assumption that everybody in this room knows who Fidel Castro is. And if you don't, you may not be in the right room. But again, so I want to follow that up by asking if anybody knows who Efraín Ríos Montt is.
Yeah.
Okay. Guatemala. One person, okay. Now, that's telling in and of itself, because earlier this year, General Ríos Montt, who was a military general who ran Guatemala for 16 months in the early 80s, during that country's brutal civil war. He was brought up on trial in Guatemala on charges of genocide, right-wing military dictator. And so, in a blog that I write for foreignpolicy.com, I wrote, I didn't pass judgment on whether Ríos Montt was guilty or not guilty on charges of genocide, but I asked the question, how is it that right-wing military dictators in Latin America, whether it's Ríos Montt in Guatemala or Pinochet in Chile, how is it that they are hounded to their dying days by international activists, and no one makes a sound about the crimes of Fidel Castro against the Cuban people? No one is calling for his accountability, for his trial on charges. And that question generated an angry leftist to write in the comments section, how on earth can you compare the crime, I mean, whatever Fidel Castro did to the likes of a Ríos Montt and a General Pinochet? And I looked at that, and again, reaffirmed, of course, confirmed that we still have a problem. And Ríos Montt, as I said, was on trial for the deaths of 1,700 indigenous Guatemalans in the highlands during that brutal civil war. He ruled for 16 months. Pinochet a little bit longer, about 15 years. Pinochet is usually attributed to about 3,000 deaths to his dictatorship in 15 years. Now, I understand it's never a good thing to get into a comparison about death and destruction, which is worse. But for goodness sake, ladies and gentlemen, Fidel Castro ran Cuba as the absolute dictator for 50 years, and is also attributed to about 100,000 Cuban deaths can be attributed to his. This is a country of what was about 6 million in 1959 to about 11 million today. Writes a biography of Che Guevara, and so he goes to Cuba to do his research, and he is subjected to the whole 9 yards, and comes back and includes a chapter. It's a big tome. There's a chapter in his biography about Che Guevara that talks about the Battle of Santa Clara. It's a city in Cuba. And of course, he got absolutely credulously goes down to Cuba and gets all of the information from Cuban commissars about the Battle of Santa Clara. That's his research. And so what he gets is a highly fictionalized account of the Battle of Santa Clara, where Che Guevara is presented as this heroic, absolutely militarily brilliant guerrilla general that vanquishes a massive Batista army because of his absolute guerrilla brilliance. Well, John Lee Anderson swallows it whole, includes it in his book on Che Guevara. But this is the problem. It doesn't stop there. An otherwise very respectable writer and opinion maker is Max Boot, who I believe is now affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations. I read his writings, and very solid. He's right of center, and so he writes a book on guerrilla warfare. Huge book that's out now on the shelves, and he cites the Anderson book as his source to present a highly fictionalized account of Che Guevara's military prowess. So this was exposed by a Cuban-American author by the name of Humberto Fontova, who has written some brilliant books exposing all of these myths. And Humberto had gone and actually interviewed people who were there at Santa Clara the day of the battle. It turned out it was to be kind. It was referred to as a skirmish. It was in no way anything like any pitched battle. It was a cat and mouse little game that the guerrillas played with Batista's police forces and security forces. And the total casualties of that day, I think, were 6. But yet, here we have, otherwise, anybody in this room, I'm sure, would say, Max Boot, he's a reliable guy. I'll read his book on guerrilla warfare. But you're going to get an entirely fictionalized account of what happened that day. So anyway, that is, again, the challenge for all of us, everybody in this room, because you're here because you care about freedom, you care about the historical record, you care about the people who are coming after us. And you want them to get a clear, unfictionalized account of the historical record. So in order to prepare them for their lives, in order to prepare them to make decisions about how best to maximize prosperity, human happiness of them and their families. Latin America today, let me just go briefly, 21st century socialism as brought to us by the late Hugo Chavez. Obviously, old wine in a new bottle. What happened in Latin America and why we are still carrying this historical burden of these populists that pretend or want to convince everybody they're still animated by Marxist-Leninist thought. Today it's Venezuela, it's Ecuador, it's Bolivia, and depending on if he's taking his meds or not, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, is that about 15 years ago, the radical left in Latin America got smart. And, it happens. Even a blind squirrel will find an acorn once in a while. They figured out that shooting their way into power was not really working out too well. And so they began to understand that they could use the trappings of democracy, use the institutions of democracy, because as in Latin America, very nascent, very weak, very pliable, they could use the trappings, the mechanics of democracy to get into power. And as Ariel said, populism. They have exploited populism to get into the political game, to get into power by stoking resentments, stoking envy, and for example, well, and that's easy to understand if you know Latin America, because Latin America's biggest problem continues to be inequality of opportunity, inequality of economic standing. So they ride waves of resentments and envy into power, and once they get there, then they begin to hollow out what's left of any other institutions. They begin to write new constitutions that invest more power in the executive. They undercut separation of powers. They use the legal system and the corruptibility of the courts to squeeze the media and to also squeeze the opposition. So that these countries now are, even though they ostensibly well, we were elected, they use that as a pretense to then impose the types of characteristics and what we know to be the authoritarian model, the totalitarian model. They're not there, obviously, on the totalitarian model yet, but they certainly do have a neo-authoritarian bent, whereby opposition is highly constrained. There is no outlet for opposition due to control of the media. Economies are centralized, more state ownership, driving out foreign investment, driving out U.S. companies, and again, refounding their countries on this nebulous model of 21st socialism. The good news is that we can be confident that that the contradictions of such systems will inevitably catch up with them. But again, the United States policy should be obviously to make sure our friends succeed, and don't provide any succor to our enemies. Right now, after all of the insults, after blaming the United States for giving Chavez his cancer, for blaming U.S. officials with trying to assassinate him, Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, the Obama administration is still bending over backwards to restore relations with Venezuela. And that is just sending a terrible signal throughout the hemisphere. With that, I'll stop, because I know we are running up on
Our final speaker of the afternoon will be Dr. Yang John Lee, who, as you know, who were there at the ceremony this morning, is the recipient of the 2013 Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. Dr. Yang has been a tireless advocate of freedom and democracy, as founder of the Foundation for China in the 21st Century and president of Initiatives for China. And he's an inspiration to all who love liberty and are committed to the freedom and independence of all people. So please, Dr. Yang.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Good afternoon. Hear me well? Okay, okay. And first thing I want to say is communism is not legacy in China. It is everyday reality. And people at this foundation, of course, believe in free market capitalism. And many people in this country mistake China's economy for a free market. So I'm telling you, there's no such a thing as free market in China. And I will tell you what it is and how it came into being, briefly. So the communist rule can be roughly divided into 3 periods. First one, from 1949, when communists took power in China, to late 70s, when Deng Xiaoping began the reform. Then the second period, the beginning of reform to Tiananmen Square massacre. And the third would be the Tiananmen massacre till this day. In the first 30 years of CCP's rule in China, I said in my speech today, it conducted the cruelest theft of private property and built a totalitarian central planning system which resulted in 36 million deaths of starvation during the Great Leap Forward, including 3 of my direct family members. And the CCP constantly generated the bloody political turmoil, including Cultural Revolution, everybody know that. And that resulted in another 30 million deaths. And it created most numerous cases of injustice. If you go to China, you ask anybody on the street whether his or her family was affected during these years. Very likely you will only hear yes, nothing else. And of course we know during these years the communists perpetrated barbarous destruction of China's historical heritage, traditional culture, morality, and religious beliefs, and also natural environment. And tens of millions of families were thrown into disaster, unspeakable suffering, and the entire country brought to the brink of collapse when Mao Zedong died. And not long after Mao Zedong died, Deng Xiaoping took power and began the reform, seeking to reverse the previous course that entered the second period I just mentioned. And people soon found that CCP was conducting the other of the 2 diametrically opposed pieces of a devil's business. Remember at first, in the name of revolution, they grabbed private property to build a planned economy and publicly owned economy. And in the name of reform, now they began another a piece of a devil's business. You know, they steal, in the name of reform, they stole public property and put it into the private pockets of party officials and their associates. So that actually spawned the 1989 student movement, the nationwide demonstration protest against the government corruption and demanding for freedom and democracy. So that's the second period. And that demonstration, the movement ended in bloodshed of Tiananmen Square. A Tiananmen Square massacre, I mean. And over the 24 years since Tiananmen Square, the CCP has established which I called two China structure. In China, actually, there are two separate societies. The separation has come to a degree which is unprecedented, which I have not seen in any country in my life. How that came into being. The Tiananmen massacre created a strong sense of fear and dismay of general politics among the ordinary people in China. But it also created a sense of fear and a crisis within the communist regime because it had brought unprecedented public awareness to human rights and democracy. The regime had to face a totally different international domestic reality and resort to tactics to maintain the stability. The subsequent disintegration of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European bloc cast even heavier cloud on the party officials at all levels. They all began to doubt how long our flag will fly, the red flag. But shortly after Deng Xiaoping's famous Southern inspection tour in 1992, the communist officials at all levels realized the three realities. First, the Chinese Communist Party's stay in power has nothing whatsoever to do with the communist ideology. Second, economic growth means everything. That is, continued economic growth is the last best hope to keep CCP ship afloat. Third, in order to uphold the one-party dictatorship, it had to rely once again on capitalizing on the dark and evil side of human nature, spoiling the elite in exchange for their loyalty. Therefore, the corruption of the powerful elite now became accepted, endorsed, even demanded. Within the understanding of these three realities, the communist officials developed an undocumented but almost unanimously accepted code of conduct, rather code of corruption. So every piece of government power is on sale in the market, and every corner of the market is invaded by political power. I keep the story short. In that way, the result is China Inc., one of societies. I call it China Incorporated. The how China Incorporated formed. China Incorporated formed by red capitalists, first of all. And second, through the marriage between power and capital. So, before that, the sole holder, the stockholder of China Inc. are Communist Party officials. Now, during these years, in 1990s, they opened a share of China Inc. to capitalists, domestic and international, and it involved a lot of American businessmen in China, doing business in China. And they take advantage of a low human rights standard. A lot of capitalists love it. They don't have to worry about working on tension. They don't have to worry about collective bargaining power from people and organize the protest against whatever they have there. And a low environmental protection and low morality, low wages, and banning collective bargaining power. And China Inc. opened its share free to intellectuals. Those had been the conscience of the society. And because of the terror imposed after Tiananmen Square massacre and the piece of action from China Inc., many intellectuals, elite intellectuals, became cynical and become a part of China Inc. So in today, it's China. That's what we have. That's not free market. So that's power, political elite, capital, economic elite, and the intellect, social and cultural elite are bonded together with corruption adhesive to form an alliance that maintains the existing political order. So this group tried very hard in past years to project the image to the whole world, dazzling the whole world with the wealth, high-rises buildings in Beijing, Shanghai, power, glory, that the outside observers believe they are the China. They represent China. But the truth is, there's another society consisting of everybody else. I call it, in some of my talks, I call it China of citizens, not citizens. Actually, that's based on a real story.
Because in the eyes of officials, the arrogant officials, the ordinary people, the powerless, are just a shit in front of them. And that is circulated in Chinese website. So I come up with the term. So another China is a China of citizens. But I don't want to repeat that because I want to reserve my respect for my fellow citizens back in China. So I call it another China. So that's the two China structure. And how the communist regime keeps this structure. This is not free market. So if you believe in free market, China has no such a thing. And how the Chinese regime keep this structure? Let me first, before that, to tell you a little bit how these two China diverge. How two China diverge. Number one, China Inc. possesses all the political, economic, and social and cultural resources in China. Revolved with the government. And number two, the rules of the game at all levels in China are set by China Inc., who also officiates the games. In just 2 decades, China achieved a polarization of the country with unprecedented speed. We all talk about gap between the wealth and the poor. Tend to think that is a result of market. No, that is not a result of market. It is result of politics in China. And I just give you a number. 0.4% of China's household possess 17% of national wealth. That's how two societies diverge. And number three, citizens, I use it again. By no means citizens, as we are not able to enjoy basic benefit or constitutional warranted civil rights. I don't have to say that. Everybody, I think, the cases are documented in many rights groups. And number four, the elite's monopoly over power, capital, information, and its insularity makes the mobility between the two societies nearly stagnant. So it's almost impossible for ordinary people to become a member of elite now in China, even more difficult than Mao Zedong's era. Number five, the two China no longer speak a common political language. When you go to China, you run into different political language, public languages. The official language is still, very low, far from the reality. On every day is a TV show, and you get online, you will learn another language. So there is no common language, public language in China with which people can debate on public issues. And number six, the two Chinas have almost no common political life. No common political life between the two societies. And number seven, the emotional division. So the distrust of one group and with another, there's a tremendous trust deficit. And there's two hatred. The hatred against the officials, hatred against wealthy. It's ubiquitous in China. So that's how two societies diverge. And another question, how the Chinese regime keeps the two China structure. And I just try to be short, okay. On top of the traditional lies and violence, which every dictator will uses, every dictator, violence and lies. On top of that, China in the past 2 decades developed, I call it a dragon-shaped strategy. The body, dragon, the one body. Sustaining economic growth at all costs to maintain the regime's ruling legitimacy. 2 wings. I have not seen any dragon, I don't know how many wings, but I just say dragon-shaped. Okay. 2 wings, appeasing the elite with corruption, and another wing is suppressing the powerless with rogue police. China is 100% police state now. 2 claws, purging democracy activists, advocates like Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Peace Prize, jailed the only jailed Nobel laureate in the world. And another clause blocking public opinion, information flow. So that's the strategy they use to keep a two-China structure. And I think I'm running out of time. I just give you a brief description of China's reality. So communist legacy is an everyday reality in China. China has no free market. If you believe in free market and believe free market will bring democracy, I tell you the truth, there is no such a thing in China. We have to think of other strategies to help change China.
Well, we have been given much to think about from our panelists today. And it seems to me that, in a sense, that a common answer in all of these cases is that the truth and nothing but the truth must be told about communism. That's what we're committed to. We thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
I guess no time for questions.
Yeah, question. Do we have any questions? Time for questions? Dr. Edwards. Dr. Edwards. Any questions? Any? No?